I'll be talking about a project that's been really exciting to us, opening up new ways to think about catalysis and electrochemistry and how they come together, and a lot of new applications. This is work mostly done at the University of Oregon, actually. I moved to Berkeley only over the last year. So before I get started, I will mention this Oregon Center for Electrochemistry that I'm very proud of, and this degree program we started there. It's going very strong, 20 or 30 students a year that are getting put into electrochemical technology industries, particularly batteries and hydrogen, but a lot of other ones. And, if you have students that they're not quite sure if they want a PhD and they want to get into this field, this is a really fast, really high return on investment program, and I encourage you to take a look. My colleague, Paul Kempler, is running that and doing a phenomenal job. I also want to advertise briefly the Center for Electrochemistry, Electrochemical Science, Engineering, and Technology. This is something that I founded here at Berkeley, and we're really trying to build a coalition here locally, but also regionally and across the U.S. to really drive electrochemistry and the technologies that derive from it forward at an accelerated pace to solve global challenges. So today I'm going to talk about this reaction that seems very simple, but of course nothing is simple. And it's taking a water molecule and splitting that water molecule apart into its constituent ions. So dissociating the water molecule. We call this the water dissociation, WD reaction. Okay, so I'll tell you why we're interested in this and how we've catalyzed it and how we have used that to think about new technologies. And hopefully I'll get you excited about all this through the course of this webinar. So this is an electrochemical construct called a bipolar membrane, BPM for short, bipolar membrane. It's not new. It's been around for a long time, since the 50s, first envisioned. It's really the ionic analog of a semiconductor p-n junction, if you know how a semiconductor p-n junction works. So let me explain a little bit how we use this construct and why it's useful in technology and how the water dissociation reaction fits in. So typically in electrochemical devices, you of course need a electrolyte. In many devices, membrane-based devices, the electrolytes are actually polymers. So this might be here, a polymer film, might look like a piece of saran wrap, a piece of plastic saran wrap. But it's hydrated, it has water channels, so there's plenty of water in here, okay? And the polymer backbone, the most common example is Nafion, okay? You see that all over the place in electrochemical technology and commercialized technology. The fluorocarbon backbone, sulfonic acid groups, and mobile protons. So this is a solid electrolyte. We call that a cation exchange layer because it selectively moves cations. The anions are bound to the backbone. They can't move, but the cations can. There's a whole other class of membranes that are emerging for many different applications. We have a separate program looking at those for electrolysis applications that I won't really speak to today, where the backbone now has fixed positive charges. These are often quaternary ammonium groups, positively charged quaternary ammonium ions fixed to the backbone, and mobile hydroxides, or mobile anions in this case. Okay, so these are used separately in electrochemical technology as either an acidic or a basic, right, membrane electrolyte. You put two electrodes on either side, you make a fuel cell, make an electrolyzer, do all sorts of different processes. Now, what happens if you put two of these together? This is very much like a p-type semiconductor and an n-type. And so let's think about what happens if I want to transport species through this device, okay? Ionic species. So imagine I put an electrode here, and I want to pass some positive current. Okay, say I want to pass positive current in this direction. Positive current. I can do that by pushing positive ions through this film, but they run into this film. So if I want to push a proton in, right, it can't go through here. Proton can't go through here, or any cation can't go through. I could also do that by moving a hydroxide, but it would, of course, get blocked at the other layer. If I reverse the polarity of my current, I have the same problem. So one of these layers is going to block an ion of a specific charge. So how does this system actually pass current? Well, it can pass current if neutral species, for example, water in this case, move through the water channels, go to the junction, and then at that junction, I somehow, it's mediated by the voltage, by the electric field, dissociate that water and generate the carriers that subsequently move out. So that's how I would move current in the left to right direction. And of course, I can drive that reaction in reverse. I can recombine and make water molecules. Now, why is this interesting? This is interesting because, for example, in the situation where I'm dissociating the water, I might have an electrode over here, some electrode material driving some reaction. That electrode sees strong acid. Naphion's like 1 molar sulfuric acid, similar pH. Whereas I have an electrode over here that sees strong base. So now I have an electrochemical cell that actually sees 2 different pH microenvironments in the same cell, and it can run a steady state, assuming this reaction is fast. There's many other reasons that I'll highlight here in a second. So there's actually lots of existing applications for bipolar membranes. It's a commercial product. You can buy these. And here's one of them that I particularly like. Say you have a winery and you want to adjust the pH of your wine. Of course, you could just add acid to your wine, but as you add acid, it will neutralize species. It will make salt, right? So what if I want to adjust the pH without changing the ionic strength? Well, here's a way you can do that. In fact, it's done. This is a picture from a local winery in Eugene, Oregon. So I can flow wine in, right? And if I have a bipolar membrane on one side and a cation-selective membrane on the other, and I force current, the water will dissociate here. That's the only mechanism to move current. So you can force the water dissociation here. You make protons, you put protons in, and you sweep potassium out. I've just adjusted the wine pH without changing its ionic strength. So it's used a lot actually in food processing, or I don't know if I'd say a lot, but it definitely has many applications for doing processing and a pH adjustment in food science. Okay, so this are old applications, niche applications. Well, there's a lot of interest in these for broader use in electrochemistry. So I already mentioned this. Here's an electrolyzer. And he wrote this, and one of the things you can do, right? So if you have this ability to dissociate water molecules, make protons, make hydroxides, I can run my anode, for example, making oxygen in an electrolyzer at pH 14. That's great for using inexpensive catalysts. And I can run my cathode at pH 0, which is really great for getting very, very fast hydrogen kinetics. So one could argue that this is optimal microenvironments for water electrolysis. Also for other things like CO2, I'll talk about. There's reasons to use this for a fuel cell. In that case, it's called a self-humidifying fuel cell, and this concept has been developed previously. But I'll get to why some of these things have been limited so far. In this case, you can take the protons and hydroxides, recombine them in the middle. You can control the thickness of each of these layers to control the relative distribution of the water molecules to the electrodes, and you can control the hydration in the electrodes, and that solves some problems in fuel cell technology. And it also allows you to do your cathode reaction using non-precious metal catalysts because of the locally alkaline environment. So there's interest in fuel cells. I'm going to fly through some of these examples. There's been lots of flurry of activity using these BPMs, bipolar membranes, and in CO2 or carbonate electrolysis. Very simply, if I have an electrolyzer, a cathode, I feed in CO2, but CO2 is in equilibrium, right, with bicarbonate. It has to be. CO2 is a weak acid. If I had, for example, what often people were using is an anion exchange membrane here only, that carbonate can actually get pumped through the cell electrochemically carrying the migration current, and that's bad. You don't want to lose the reactant, and it goes over and gets mixed with your oxygen. And so there are lots of examples of this in the literature where people were using membrane devices to reduce CO2 to useful products, but they were losing the majority of their CO2. And you can look at that from the CO2 to O2 output stream ratio. And so if you use an alkaline membrane, you get a lot of CO2 getting pumped across. If you use a bipolar membrane, it stops it. And it stops it because it has to fight against the outflux of protons from the bipolar membrane. So bipolar membranes, they control microenvironments, and they control unwanted crossover of species. Here's going back to the so-called electrodialysis example. This is a different application. It's related to the wine stack I showed you earlier. But this one, people are really interested. A number of companies, not just carbon engineering, there's a whole bunch now trying to do this at scale where you're doing something called salt splitting. So imagine this is NaCl from seawater or other brines. I can make a membrane stack that selectively drives the anions this way and the cations this way. A cation exchange membrane, anion exchange membrane. If I drive current from an anode and cathode, this stack is going to be repeated many times. So you only need one anode and cathode. Those are not the important parts of the cell. The important parts are the membrane stack. And then through the bipolar membrane, I can only dissociate water as my primary current carrying mechanism. So protons go here, hydroxides go here, hydroxides go here. So this is making base and acid, strong base and strong acid from salt. And it turns out this is has the best thermodynamics for making these moderately concentrated acid and base. And base is what you need to capture CO2 from many sources. You need strong base to react with CO2 to capture it from the air or the ocean. And the thermodynamics and the rates is what's driving a lot of investment in this area. And here's an example of an actual stack that people have designed, an air contactor or an ocean contactor stack. This is the company Captura that's doing this, trying to do this commercially. So this is all great, lots of applications. So I've spent, 10 minutes here telling you how wonderful these bipolar membranes are, how they enable all these great things. But, there's a big problem here, actually. And it's something that we are working on solving. And actually, I think we've solved it. I'll try to convince you of that today. If you go buy a bipolar membrane, there's two suppliers. One's Neosepta, Japan, one's Fumasep from Germany. And you go put one of those bipolar membranes into a device, you'll see that if you want to pass any reasonable current, this is not a high current for a membrane technology. You might want to be at amps per centimeter squared for a fuel cell or electrolyzer. You have a huge voltage loss driving this reaction. So this is fine, if you want to make Pinot Noir a little bit more acidic. You don't really care about the electrical costs, but it's a big deal if you're doing any commodity chemical synthesis like acid and base, or mining type applications, or energy technologies like fuel cells and electrolyzers. So really the problem comes down to we need to understand how to get rid of all the voltage losses in this region. And if we could make these sort of systems operate so anybody can just take this thing and use it like a piece of Nafion in their electrochemical device and not worry about that extra voltage coming from these kinetics, it could have a big impact based on the applications I just showed you. So that's what we started working on. It's useful to think about a little bit from a basic physics perspective, how these things operate and what they look like. This is, again, an analogy to a PN junction. The physics are actually quite similar. So this is something called the electrochemical potential of each species of hydroxide and protons through the device. So here's the anion exchange layer, the cation exchange layer, and we're going to have this stuff in the middle where water dissociation is going to take place. We're going to put the catalyst in here. Now, at equilibrium, of course, the electrochemical potential is just dG dN. So there's the chemical potential, but we're going to add a term to the electrostatic energy. So the charge of the species, Faraday's constant, and the electrostatic potential. So that's the electrostatic energy of a charged species. So and this is the chemical potential that folks know about and have learned about in their undergraduate work. Okay, so at equilibrium, of course, these things must have the same free energy everywhere. Okay, but I have a strong base. So this is base, and this is acid. Okay, so I'm putting this base and acid together, but they're solid bases and solid acids. So what happens when you add acid and base together? Well, of course, some of the acid, some of the base recombines to make water. But because these are solid acids, solid bases, remember they have these counter ions that are on the backbone. If I take some of the protons, I take some of the hydroxides, and I recombine them, I'm going to leave behind these fixed charges. Those fixed charges develop an electric potential across the interface here, right? There's electric potential here, just like a depletion layer in a PN junction. That electric potential adds electric free energy to the chemical potential. So I actually have a high concentration of base, a high concentration of acid in equilibrium with each other, and they're held back by this electric potential that develops. Okay, so that's an equilibrium. So this is the system you kind of have in your mind. And then how do you pass current through this thing? Well, you change these equilibrium polarizations. So for example, under operation conditions, this is what we call reverse bias. increase the amount of charge here by applying a potential. That increases the potential drop, and that makes the hydroxide and protons out of equilibrium. So if this reaction is occurring, the protons will be driven this way, and the hydroxides will be driven that way. And then Lechatlier's principle will apply, and water will dissociate to regenerate those species. So that's kind of how you think about what we're doing here. And this is the reverse case where things are happening in the recombination of protons and hydroxides in the junction. So there's two key points that I just want to emphasize from this physics perspective. There's a large electric potential across the bipolar membrane junction at equilibrium. These distances that we're going to talk about are on the order of 1 nanometer to 1 micron, depending what we put in the junction. So there's about a volt of potential across that distance. So it's pretty large. There's also a very large activity gradient, concentration gradient in protons, because we have essentially over the same distance, 1 molar acid and base held back from each other. Okay, so those are the key points in understanding the physics. Now let's think about this reaction, water dissociating to protons and hydroxides. This is water auto dissociation reaction. You can write the Kw, general chemistry, about 10 to the negative 14. Of course, it's the ratio of these microscopic rate constants, if you put them in the right units. And these have been measured. So the backward rate constant, the recombination rate constant being measured, these guys, very famous in catalysis science, both won Nobel Prizes. Eigen actually won the Nobel Prize for understanding how to measure very fast chemical reactions. And this was a probe reaction he used, proton hydroxide recombination. And it turns out that their backward rate constant, not surprisingly, is encounter limited, diffusion limited, very fast. And so by this ratio, you can calculate that on average, a water molecule, right, it will dissociate every 10 hours, very, very slowly. In this region where this association is happening, if this is the mechanism whereby I just remove the H plus and OH minus, and the natural bulk water rate constant applies for dissociating the H2O, I could pass maybe 500 microamps of current. So a negligible amount of current could be passed by this mechanism. So there's something else going on here. It's not this simple bulk water auto-dissociating and then separating the H plus and OH minus. I need 1 million times more water dissociation than this natural kinetics would give me in pure water. So what is going on? Well, there's a early study we did. This is, we really started getting interested in this, a number of years ago, 6 or 7 years ago now. There's a lot of work to get going here. We did a couple things. We started studying these, really the first to look at these in so-called MEA geometries, membrane electrode assemblies. And what that allowed us to do is there's no other ions. We don't have any contacting salt solutions. We put the electrodes right on, just like a membrane electrolyzer, membrane fuel cell. In fact, we just adapted our expertise in those areas to do this, which was very, very useful because that means we can study these species transporting and dissociating in the absence of all other convoluting ions that might be present. And then, building off work from very, very nice work in, I think, the late 80s by Simons, who kind of proposed that you might be able to dissociate water. He was looking at small molecule or polymer N groups dissociating water by this mechanism, and we were going to apply it to metal oxides here in the simplest sense. You could dissociate water in 2 steps instead of 1 step. So this is sort of the bulk water mechanism, auto-dissociation. But, if I had a slightly acidic metal site, it could donate a proton to water, make a hydronium, and then a deprotonated site, either the same one or a different one, if they communicate, could then abstract a proton and return the metal hydroxide, for example, and make a OH minus. So we thought this might be operative. We screened a whole bunch of metal oxides. I'm not going to go through this paper very carefully because we have a lot of better data now that's more mechanistically insightful. But, we saw general trends where the pH of the surface of the metal oxide really matters, and you want to match the pH of the metal oxide you use for the catalytic rate. So this is overpotential across this region. It's lower if the pH matches the local pH of the membrane that catalyst is in contact with. So we developed these bilayer catalysts, so you want acidic metal oxides on the acidic layer. And you do this, and, you can make actually really quite remarkably good bipolar membranes that dissociate water really fast. And so this is just some early data showing that we can run our bipolar membranes roughly 5 to 10 times higher current density, than the commercial systems, really without any significant loss in voltage. I'll explore this in more detail, but I just wanted to highlight this early thing. So we published this paper. People were really interested in it because it sort of really opened up the energy technology space for using bipolar membranes. But there were lots of things we didn't understand, many, many, many things. And so we started digging into this and really trying to understand what's going on. We did a lot of work on TiO2 catalysts. So these can be thought of, as a sort of a layer of nanoparticles that are sandwiched by these two polymer films. It's all filled with water, so you should think about these particles, and they're going to be 5 to sort of tens of nanometers in diameter on average. They're often crystalline metal oxides, and they're flooded with water, and they're pushed between these two membrane layers. So we did a lot of work with TiO2 because, of course, there's a ton known about the surface of TiO2, how to synthesize it in various particle sizes, and many things can be purchased. Okay, so we kind of use this as a model system, and it dissociates water reasonably well in both pH regimes, both acidic and basic. It doesn't dissolve. It's a very stable oxide, so it was a great model system for us. So the first thing we did is kind of obvious. If you have a catalyst, it would be nice to know how much the rate of the reaction depends on how much catalyst you have. So as you load up catalyst in this interfacial region here, okay, and it gets better. So the voltage I need to drive this overall cell, this is the total cell voltage, so it includes that for driving the thermodynamics, which is sort of 1.23 volts. The cell gets much, much, much better, okay? As you would expect, more catalyst, faster reaction. But then you put too much catalyst in and it gets bad again, okay? So you get these sort of U-shaped curves with the amount of catalyst and the cell voltage. Now, what's going on here, you can look here and see the optimal layers sort of look like this or this. They're mostly covering the surface. They're not too thick, though. The thickness is about 100 or 200 nanometers. So this is optimal. So why is this? Okay, why is this? Well, he's graduated now off actually working at a startup company that's not ours, but is using this technology to carbon capture. I said, Palkun, this is actually really, really obvious because you have all these particles here, right? And if I make this H plus and OH minus in the middle of this catalytic layer, if it's really thick, it has to move through a very, very thick catalytic layer. And these polymers are made to conduct hydroxides, but these are just metal oxides. They're probably not very good proton and hydroxide conductors. So it probably will have some ohmic loss here. So I'll call this an ohmic loss, and the junction here associated with that. So that was the hypothesis. I thought it was fairly obvious. So how Kuhn went to test this. The first thing he did is develop a good impedance experiment to sort of separate out the various components of the voltage losses as current passes through the circuit. So this is a typical equivalent circuit analysis, and this is called the Nyquist plot, if you haven't seen this. And so just look at this purple one. There's a semicircle here and a semicircle here. And the simple way to look at these Nyquist plots are that each semicircle represents a parallel RC element. So, we have two parallel RC elements. That's the simplest way you could fit this. And then there's this intercept here. This is high frequency. This is like, 100 kilohertz or megahertz. So this is frequency increasing in this direction. This part where it intercepts we call that the HFR, or high frequency resistance. It's often attributed to the series resistance of moving ions, ohmic resistances, okay? So you can look at these curves very quickly. You can fit these data. There's always some concern when you're mapping, data to a model like this. But one nice thing that we can do is we can, of course, change the catalyst loading, and we can see that one arc here, see this arc doesn't change as I change the amount of catalyst in this layer. And so that's definitely the RC element that's associated with the two electrodes. It's a lumped element. You can't separate it in this case. And this one is associated with the process that's happening in the junction. That's why it's so sensitive to how much catalyst you have. Okay, so this is going to allow us to isolate the different relative impedances from as a function of thickness for this catalyst. What you see here is pretty interesting. So the charge transfer resistance, that's the electrode. It doesn't really change, okay? There's some noise here, but this is independent of what you put in the middle. Of course, that makes sense because these reactions here and here, they're happening spatially separated from where water dissociation happens. So that's expected. But the thing is, this RS value, this is the ohmic part of moving things around. That one, it's increasing a little bit, but not very much. The vast majority of why you get this U shape is from this water dissociation resistance, which we kind of had attributed to the kinetics of this reaction, of generating these species and driving that water dissociation process. So that's not what we expected. So why might this be? So we went in and we said, okay, well, we better measure how good hydroxides and protons can move through these TiO2 catalytic layers. Remember, they're just TiO2 particles, no ligands, native surface functionalization, flooded with water. Now, instead of making a bipolar membrane, we just take two membranes of the same polarity. So this is a proton conductor, a proton conductor. They're both selective conductors for protons. So if we drive current through there, we are forcing the TiO2 layer to move protons. Okay, so we just change that thickness and measure the differential resistance. We do the same thing when you have a hydroxide conducting contacts to our catalyst. This is P25 is the label. It's Degussa P25 TiO2. It's a good standard for TiO2. Everybody has it. And what you get here is you get the slope, and the slope tells you the conductivity of hydroxides and protons through that TiO2 layer. And what's interesting is the TiO2 layer has surprisingly high ionic conductance for both. So you can go to very high loadings, and you don't get a big ohmic component to your resistance. So it really must be, again, something to do with this reaction. So why would that reaction slow down? Okay, why would the reaction slow down? There's other evidence. So, we looked at, of course, many different materials. I'm showing you a few here. SiO2. I told you this mechanism where you had like hydroxyl groups and protons going on and off the hydroxyl groups, why is SiO2 such a bad catalyst? Look, it's huge voltage for dissociating water. We can never make SiO2 work, even though it has tons of hydroxyl groups, lots of ways to modify it. Well, one thing about SiO2 is it's an electronic insulator. It doesn't move electrons. It doesn't have any free electrons in it. And then we went over and measured things that are metallic. So there's iridium oxide is very expensive, but it's a metallic oxide, so it's very good conductor of electrons. We noticed for iridium oxide, we could go to very high mass loadings and still get fairly good cell performance. Also, platinum dissociates water. Of course, we don't want to use those precious metals practically, but their shape of these curves are very different. And it's only for these semiconductors, and these different things are rutile and anatase and different sizes. I won't get too much into the details there because there's a lot of convoluting factors, but generally you always see this U-shaped curve when you have semiconductor particles with a narrow optimum. So this is really interesting. So you really need to think about the electronic properties of the material, but we're not doing electron transfer. There's no electron transfer here, right? There's no Faradaic chemistry. So somehow the electrons and the protons are coupled to each other. Why and how could this be? Well, there's an old theory developed by Lars Onsager, one of the most famous physical chemists of his time. And he developed this theory to explain something called the second Wien effect. And the second Wien effect is actually kind of similar to dissociation. It's basically saying that a weak acid, the extent of dissociation of a weak acid is modulated by the local electric field that weak acid or weak electrolyte experiences. It's a very simple argument. The paper is kind of complicated, but the argument is pretty simple. If I have neutral reactant and I have charged product and I have a dipole in my transition state, I can lower the dipole free energy. I can lower the transition state free energy through that dipole field interaction, and that will speed up the rate. The activation barrier for the process goes up. And of course, I just told you we have fairly strong electric fields in these junctions. So, maybe there's something to be said here for how the electronic properties of this catalytic material affects this. So, here's an example. So this is a diagram showing the schematicized illustration showing the charge density that develops in the anion exchange layer, the cation exchange layer, and the water dissociation layer. Now imagine, I told you some of the protons, right, they've recombined at equilibrium with some of the hydroxides. So you leave behind some fixed charge. These are so-called the space charge layers. So they develop the field. Now imagine I put a water association catalyst in here that's a really good electronic conductor. Well, those electrons will polarize, right? They'll polarize and all the charge will sit at their surfaces, and there'll be the field in the middle will be zero if I just put a sheet of, say, steel in the middle there, right? It would screen that electric field completely. So you could think about, electroconductive water dissociation catalysts somehow focusing the electric field, focusing where the potential drops by a redistribution of free electrons or any electronic ability to strongly polarize in the presence of this field. So we thought maybe this is an explanation. Okay, so let's look at that. So this is a way we tested it. We tested it by taking a TiO2 film, and we made it very large. So the hypothesis was, okay, it's so large, the electric field is not that strong, the potential's dropping over too large of a distance, and that's why the voltage to dissociate the water is so high. Now, if we take that same film, and instead of only have the TiO2, semiconducting TiO2, we mix it with conductive carbon nanoparticles. This is acetylene carbon black, ACB. Now, this material by itself doesn't do any water dissociation. We've separately shown that. It doesn't have any hydroxyl groups on the surface. There are not very many. So, it's not itself driving the reaction. But when you mix it with the P25 and you increase the conductivity of the composite, boom, the voltage to dissociate water dramatically drops until, in fact, it's almost equivalent to the optimally thick TiO2 layer. So the sort of hypothesis from this is that, okay, we must be focusing electric fields in a way that gives us sufficient driving force to dissociate the water. So this is interesting. It gives us a new sort of perspective on how the ability of electrons to polarize in local environments can actually modulate chemical reactions that are happening on their surface. So we're going to come back to this in a moment. This hypothesis, by the way, has never been directly tested, and particularly not in the context of these bipolar membranes, even though lots of people, including my collaborators and colleagues, sort of applied those principles in simulations. Okay, so we're going to actually test this in a moment here and see if this picture is right or if there's other pictures that might be better. So to do this, to kind of look at these mechanisms and to try to get some useful data, we developed a little bit more sophisticated sensing technique. The challenge, we built these devices, these MEA devices. The advantage is we have nothing except for OH minus and H plus as our free carriers. There's no other ions around. That's great. It's a solid state device essentially with liquid water hydrating all these layers. But it's harder to put things like reference electrodes in and to really accurately measure these interfacial drops associated with driving the water dissociation. So we developed techniques to do that, but which I won't go into. I want to emphasize this particular technique, which is very, very simple and very fast. It allows us to sense the electric potential with a reference electrode, even though this reference electrode is outside of the cell. The electric potential is relatively constant through this strip of membrane that brings the electrochemical cell outside of the actual current carrying part of the cell. We do that for both sides, for the acidic side and the basic side, and then we put two reference electrodes in, and this allows us to directly, you can kind of see here how this works, directly measure the actual voltage very fast across this junction. So we did a lot of, calibration and making sure this all makes sense. I could tell you how it matches the impedance spectroscopy and those resistances I was telling you about. It all works in quantitatively correct ways, so we can use this to look at some important parameters. Like, for example, another obvious thing if you're doing catalysis science is, gosh, if you have a catalyst, you want to know how the rate depends on how much catalyst you have. You also probably want to know how the rate depends on what temperature you're at. Not always trivial to do in an electrochemical environment, but now we have a good way to do that. So here's the water dissociation voltage. Now it's just the part dropping across that catalyst layer. So that's why the numbers are small as a function of temperature. Okay. Now we can interpolate at a constant driving force. So one of the things about electrochemistry that's a little different than most thermocatalysis reactions is we control the delta G of the reaction. That's what we're controlling here with this by turning up that voltage. We're changing the delta G of reaction. We're changing the driving force, and we're looking how the rate depends on driving force. That's what one of these curves is. So if I extrapolated a constant driving force, a constant voltage for different temperatures, I can then take those points and build Arrhenius curves. Okay, and I can build those Arrhenius curves as a function of driving force, and all these Arrhenius plots are linear. Okay, so what that means is they all have roughly the same activation energy. And what's changing is the intercept, okay? So the prefactor, or sort of attempt frequency, one might think, in a simple general chemistry perspective. And this was actually kind of surprising, okay? Because in electrochemistry, when we think about often voltage-induced charge transfer reactions, we invoke pictures of things called like Butler-Volmer model, or you might think about a Marcus model. They're similar models of how charge transfer. And usually you might draw something like this. So if this is my reaction coordinate, energy, I might draw a precursor state that as I move through the reaction, say I have some oxidized species plus an electron in my electrode, and I have some reduced species here, and I want to know the rate at which that reaction occurs as a function of driving force. The simple picture is, well, okay, if I apply more driving force here, I'm going to raise the energy of the electrons and the activation barrier is going to go down. So that's usually the role of voltage, is often thought driving force over potential. That's what I'm doing here in a conventional electrochemical picture. It's often thought to affect the activation energy. That's the typical interpretation. But this voltage is not affecting the activation energy. That's interesting. So what is it doing? Well, we went back and we made systems that didn't have any catalyst, okay? By the way, the Wien effect, if this Wien effect was happening, okay, this was the mechanism by which voltage by electric field made the reaction faster, we would see this is a change in activation. We would expect to see this. So we went back and we made devices with no catalyst, okay? And then you measure the activation energy. I mean, these are terrible bipolar membranes. You need very large voltages to drive any significant current. But what you find is the measured activation energy is, in fact, a function of the driving force. So you are really lowering that activation barrier. So that sort of idea of the local electric field making that, stabilizing that transition state dipole is maybe that's right when you don't have a catalyst. But as soon as you have these catalytic materials, there is no dependence. These are the different loadings. They're all, different performances, but there's no strong dependence of the activation energy with driving. There's also a kinetic isotope effect. So obviously protons are involved in this reaction. With deuterium, it's a slower reaction. You can compare these sort of activation energies to those for sort of just protons hopping in water. And, in this case, they're significantly larger, though we have catalysts that make that better. And one of the hypotheses is you're moving protons in a very different local environment than bulk water. So how do we interpret all the data, temperature dependence, loading dependence? We have these pictures of where the fields are. So we analyze this as sort of in a microscopic way to get a microscopic physical picture here. So again, here's our anion exchange layer. Here's our cation exchange layer. Here's our water association catalyst layer. Here's some schematized electric potential drop across that junction. And I've sort of invoked this idea that maybe the field is getting screened, so there's more potential drops sort of in the interfacial regions because of the mobile charges. And then, so this is the physical picture of what the sort of interface looks like. And then how does this equation sort of describe what might be happening here? Okay, so this is a sort of what is called a phenomenological equation, meaning we just wrote it down based on reasonable intuitive picture of what might be happening. So this part here, this is the rate, the current is the rate. This part here is an exponential that depends on the equilibrium barrier for the reaction. And then this part is a commonly used part in electrochemistry to describe how that equilibrium barrier changes as you change the driving force, the voltage driving force, the overpotential in this case for water dissociation. Okay, so if alpha is small, if alpha is 0, there's no effect. If alpha is 1, all the driving force goes into changing the barrier. That's what this exponential says. Now, typically in electrochemistry, this is a constant or related to the reaction, but here we've actually split this into two terms. A term that we're going to call G naught. It's going to be related to how many active sites there are for dissociation and some sort of attempt frequency. And then we're going to multiply that by again, the driving force. So the driving force must affect the prefactor in some way, and this is the simplest way to do that. So now we have three parameters to fit every single temperature-dependent, loading-dependent piece of data I showed you. And when you do that, you can see some very interesting things. So if you don't have any catalyst, alpha is not even close to 1. It's very small. Typically, alphas are about 0.5 in electrochemical reactions. We're seeing alpha of about 10 times lower. It means the potential is driving the reaction, but it's only having a very small effect relative to total driving force drop. And, the reason of that is often in electrochemical reaction, at least we think, you have a metal, okay, and you have a double layer, and you're driving a charge across the double layer, and the charge transfer distance is commensurate with the distance of delta phi, the electric potential across that interface. Here, delta phi is developing over this much larger distance, and the protons are transferring over a shorter distance, right? So one might expect that the effect of the field would be substantially, in fact, the geometric ratio of those distances is about 0.04. The activation barriers at equilibrium are pretty independent of how much catalyst we have. The thing that really changes is G naught. So this is sort of the active site at attempts. So this basically fits all of our data. We don't know for sure if it's right, but why would this be? Like, how could you explain this prefactor dependence? Okay. So we can look at this as sort of more of a level of microscopic detail we could imagine. So certainly the TiO2 particles, they have lots of protons on the surface, OH groups, they're OH groups really, or protons sitting on a bridging oxo or whatever. And these are all communicating with each other, right? They're all hopping around in thermal equilibrium, bop, 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 bop. And, any one of those sites can exchange protons with water. So I will, of course, even at equilibrium, have lots of protons hopping on and off the surface. Okay. So now when I polarize this device, adding more electric field, what's going to happen? Well, we already showed that the electrons in the TiO2 appear to have an effect. So the electrons in the TiO2 might polarize themselves to counteract that field. That's going to push the electric field to the interfacial. This is sort of like making a little double layer. This is a little double layer. This is a little bipolar electrode, if you will. But I'm passing a protonic current. So what would that do? That's going to help organize the water for productive proton transfer in a selective direction. That's our picture. So we can put protons off on one side of the particle and protons on the water on another side of the particle. And that is equivalent to saying that this sort of iron-Polanyi model of kinetics, right? That you have you can split your free energy of activation into an enthalpy part and an entropy part. And if the electric field was changing the entropy of activation, for example, by lowering the entropy of the precursor state, this water is getting organized, it's lower entropy, it's closer to the low entropy transition state, which must have the water pointing in one direction, that's equivalent to a mechanism to increase the rate. So that's sort of our picture right now. So let's go back and see if this picture can be used to do anything useful. Now, I'll just wrap up in the next couple minutes and then be delighted to have discussion and questions. So, we screened a lot of different materials using this idea, sort of simple idea that the water dissociation activity should be somehow related to surface area, the concentration of sites for accepting and donating protons, and the electronic conductivity because of that field screening effects. And certainly if you plot that all on a three-dimensional plot, it all sort of drives you to better catalysts are down in this corner, high conductivity and high surface hydroxyl coverage, and you can fit that to an analytical expression. It's just a fit. So these things don't necessarily have any physical meaning except for the dependencies found in this fit, but it all sort of makes sense that those are the parameters, and it holds when you look at many different materials. You anneal them at different temperatures, et cetera, and you measure these parameters. So using this sort of design, okay, we said, okay, we want really good electronic conductors. To get that, we probably want highly crystalline materials. In fact, whenever we try amorphous materials or like MOFs, metal organic frameworks that have high surface areas, they're really terrible for dissociating water. So we realized that, from the literature really, and from trial and error, tin oxide, if you take SnCl4, it hydrolyzes at at room temperature, below in liquid water to form crystalline tin oxide. You never have to heat it up. So we get these very crystalline particles. You probably can't see them, but you'll see all the lattice fringes if you look closely. Crystalline small particles of tin oxide, and we never have to dry them out or heat them up. So these particles both have reasonably high electronic conductivity. We've actually now fluorine doped them, which makes them even a little bit better, electronic conductors and even better performance. And they have a huge number of surface hydroxyl groups because we never had to heat them up and calcine them to crystalline. And these things really scream. So if I had put the commercial bipolar membrane on here, polarization curve would be sort of like this, okay? It would drop quite a bit of voltage, and even at 100 milliamps of current, maybe 400 millivolts at 100 milliamps of current. We are dropping, the best ones are now more about 50 millivolts of driving force at an amp of current. So this is functionally transparent. This can be put in any device and you basically don't lose any free energy. You can do it with lots of different polymers. It really, really works. And these tin oxide, this stable, tin oxide is a very stable compound. There's no reason for it to degrade. And I'm going to blow through this pretty quickly, but you can show, for example, that the local microenvironment advantage is there. It's an interesting, just a demonstration. I don't mean that this is a commercializable demonstration, but just a demonstration. If you have a bipolar membrane and you use a high or low amount of platinum at your cathode, it just doesn't matter because platinum is such a good catalyst in acidic conditions. Lowering the platinum amount doesn't matter. But if you go to an alkaline membrane electrolyzer where the kinetics of hydrogen evolution on platinum are at least 100 times slower, and you lower that same platinum amount, you really have a huge performance hit. So this really shows that the local environments matter. We can also do electrodialysis type experiments, but which I won't go into the details. One practical thing that was really important and causing us lots of problems for about a year is I just told you we take these two membranes and we put a bunch of powder in the middle, right? And we sandwich them together. But guess what? The mechanical interaction between the two membranes is terrible. These things would peel apart very easily. So this is a peel test on the membranes I've been showing you. They only adhere by 20 or 25 newton meters to peel them apart. Scotch, that's 4 times weaker than just Scotch tape on, two pieces of Scotch tape together. So that's a big problem. You can't sell something that has such mechanical instability. Now, in our devices, it didn't really matter because we're actively pressing on them through the membrane electrode assembly architecture. So what we've done here, by developing these really, really active catalysts, we're now patterning the catalyst and leaving some unpatterned area, and this gives us just really high adhesion. So this is actually, 4 times higher than even the commercial membranes now, along with this 20 times lower voltage. And these are really stable, also measured by other companies that are interested in using this. So this is what they look like, optimizing all this. This is just made in our lab, but we're passing this off to a couple companies that are commercializing this. And, you can make big membranes, pattern the catalyst, and, they really work well. So we're sort of pushing forward, trying to, build really high current density electrodialysis stacks that can do, acid-base synthesis, do other chemical reactions using these advanced bipolar membranes. So be on the lookout for that.